Department has ordered Cuba to expel 15 diplomats from the country's embassy in Washington. The decision comes after U.S. officials say 22 American government workers in Havana suffered health attacks that affected their hearing, balance, and vision. Last week, the U.S. cut down its own embassy staff in Cuba by a similar amount. CBS News Radio's Steve Dorsey has been covering this story and breaking news from the very beginning. He joins me on set now. Steve, first off, congratulations. You've done some fabulous reporting on this, keeping up with this. But the State Department says, and I'm quoting here, the decision today was, quote, does not presume Cuban culpability. But what do you think this means for diplomatic relations? It was just starting to thaw.
I think this is the first step that we're seeing in the U.S. in a relationship with Cuba that is much different than how it was under the Obama administration. Already we saw the president a few months ago make efforts to roll back some of the efforts that President Obama tried to make to warm up relations between his country and Cuba. And now this makes it harder to do just about everything, especially getting visas here in the U.S. and for Cubans to get visas in Cuba to go to the U.S.
We're just seeing businesses, as you mentioned, airports, airlines opening up, hotels sending big companies over, credit card companies. Well, ultimately, though, the fact that the U.S. has expelled these diplomats and the fact that the U.S. pulled diplomats from Cuba, what is the process like if you want to pull a diplomat out?
Well, they have 7 days to leave the country, according to the State Department, but they're not being deemed what the State Department calls persona non grata, which means you're not wanted in this country. Instead, the State Department is allowing these 15 diplomats from Cuba to re-enter the country if Cuba can provide assurances to the U.S. that these attacks will no longer continue. But one thing that the State Department has tried to make clear to reporters is it's not blaming Cuba. However, it says Cuba does have an international obligation to protect its diplomats, and so far it hasn't lived up to that.
You know, the U.S. has also increased the number of victims to 22, which is pretty incredible. What do we know about their conditions, and do we expect that there could be more?
Well, we know that this latest victim, this 22nd victim, actually reported symptoms as early as January, and that this person was reevaluated and then added to this total to bring that tally to 22. Many of them have severe injuries, including mild traumatic brain injury, hearing loss, nausea, trouble remembering common words and phrases. And so far the problem is, especially for doctors, what is causing this and how exactly do we diagnose them and how do we help them?
Is there a working theory as to who's behind it or what's causing it? Do we know?
There's a number of theories, Rena, including that Cuba was behind these attacks directly. And in fact, Senator Marco Rubio has questioned how Cuba can deny any kind of involvement, especially since it's happened for nearly a year in this closed country under this regime. But there are other theories that perhaps a third country could be involved, like Russia, a U.S. adversary that wanted to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Cuba. But so far, as of last month, Russia denies it had anything to do with it.
And so what's next in this?
I think next it's going to be important for us to watch what happens with these attacks. If one happens again on the island, how will the U.S. respond? It still has diplomats on the island. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says this limits the exposure to the number of diplomats left behind in Cuba. But what other measures can the U.S. take in retaliation for this? Senator Marco Rubio wants Cuba to possibly be relisted as a state sponsor of terrorism. Will the U.S. go that far?
Steve Dorsey, thank you so much for joining us on set today.
Thank you, Rena.